The frozen pipes in Marcus Rodriguez's basement weren't the only thing that had stopped working that February night. Tom Wilson's 23 years of emergency plumbing calls had never prepared him for the sound that drifted up from the darkness below, a whimpering so human it made his wrench slip from his numb fingers. The sound wasn't supposed to exist in a house this quiet, this cold, this forgotten by hope. At 11:47 p.m., Chicago's winter had already claimed 3 burst pipes on Maple Street. But the noise echoing from Marcus's basement shattered something deeper than frozen metal. It was the kind of crying that belonged to children lost in department stores, not to basements where grown men lived alone with their ghosts. Tom descended the creaking stairs, his flashlight cutting through air thick with despair and the metallic taste of old fear. In the corner, chained to a support beam, a German shepherd lifted his head, once proud, now broken, eyes that had seen war, now begging for mercy from shadows that looked like men. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Rex had been America's finest. 4 years old, 65 pounds of muscle and courage wrapped in a black and tan coat that once gleamed like polished leather under the Afghanistan sun. His service record read like a hero's resume. 12 lives saved, 37 explosive devices detected, 0 mistakes in 18 months of active duty. The tattoo inside his left ear bore witness to his valor. K9 Unit 2019, a mark of honor that now felt like a brand of abandonment. But war had a way of breaking even the strongest soldiers, and Rex was no exception. The IED explosion en route Phoenix had stolen more than his handler's life. It had shattered Rex's faith in the world's fundamental fairness. Sergeant Carlos Martinez had been 23 when the blast consumed him, his final act throwing himself over the device to shield his unit. Rex had tried to wake Carlos for 3 hours, pawing at his still chest, whimpering into unhearing ears until the medics finally pulled him away. Dr. Sarah Mitchell understood broken things. At 34, she carried her own collection of fractures, carefully hidden beneath her professional demeanor and the confident stride that carried her through the Second Chances Animal Clinic each morning. 18 months had passed since Max's death, her golden retriever struck down in the very parking lot where she now saved other people's companions. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could heal everyone's animals except her own. The clinic had become her sanctuary and her prison, its fluorescent lights burning late into countless nights while she avoided the empty apartment that still smelled faintly of dog shampoo and tennis balls. Her colleagues whispered about her obsession with lost causes, the way she'd spend her own money on animals others had given up on. They didn't understand that every rescued dog was a chance to rewrite the ending she couldn't change for Max. Marcus Rodriguez lived in the space between nightmare and waking, where the line between past and present had blurred beyond recognition. At 43, the former staff sergeant inhabited his deceased mother's house like a ghost haunting his own life. The basement had become his bunker, the only place where the walls were thick enough to muffle the screams that echoed from Kandahar province. 3 Purple Hearts gathered dust on the mantelpiece upstairs, while empty beer cans multiplied in the darkness below. Tom Wilson was the kind of man who fixed things, burst pipes, broken faucets, the small disasters that made houses uninhabitable. A master plumber for 23 years, he'd crawled through more basements than he could count, but he'd never encountered suffering that couldn't be solved with the right wrench and enough determination. Divorced and living alone in a studio apartment above his shop, Tom had learned that loneliness was just another kind of leak, persistent, damaging, and surprisingly difficult to repair permanently. The emergency call had come at 11:32 p.m., Marcus's voice slurred with something stronger than exhaustion. "Pipes burst in the basement. Water everywhere. Need someone now." Tom had heard desperation before, usually from families watching their Christmas presents float in sewage. But Marcus's voice carried a different kind of panic, the kind that made Tom grab his heaviest tools and drive faster than the icy roads should have allowed. The house on Maple Street squatted in darkness like a secret ashamed of itself. Every window was black, except for the pale glow of a television flickering behind drawn curtains. Tom's breath crystallized in the February air as he knocked, his toolkit heavy in his other hand. When Marcus opened the door, the smell hit him first. Stale beer, unwashed clothes, and something else. Something organic and wrong that made Tom's stomach clench. Marcus Rodriguez looked like a man who'd been fighting a war he couldn't win. His hair hung in greasy strands, his eyes darting everywhere except Tom's face. It's down there," he mumbled, gesturing toward a door that gaped open like a mouth. "Been flooding for hours. I tried to. Couldn't stop it myself." Tom descended into a basement that felt like descending into someone's buried trauma. His flashlight beam cut through air thick with moisture and despair, revealing concrete walls sweating with condensation and corners filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of his light. The burst pipe was obvious. A jagged split in the main line where expanding ice had finally won its battle against aging metal. But that wasn't what stopped Tom's breath in his throat. The sound came from the far corner, a soft whimpering that didn't belong in any basement Tom had ever entered. It was the sound of something in pain trying not to make noise, the kind of careful suffering that spoke of experience with consequences for crying too loudly. Tom's flashlight beam swept toward the source and illuminated a sight that would replay behind his eyelids for months afterward. A German shepherd sat chained to a support beam, his magnificent head hanging as if it had become too heavy for his neck to support. The dog's ribs showed through a coat that had once been lustrous black and tan, but now looked like fabric worn thin by too much washing. Wounds decorated his flanks in various stages of healing, some fresh enough that Tom could see the deliberate patterns, marks that spoke of intention rather than accident. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, and the dog's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't lift his head. Around the animal, the concrete floor was stained with more than just burst pipe water. Empty food bowls sat just beyond the chain's reach, a particular cruelty that made Tom's hands shake as he set down his toolkit. He's just a stray," Marcus called from the top of the stairs, his voice carrying the hollow ring of a lie told to someone who desperately wanted to believe it. "Found him a few weeks ago. Been trying to help him out." But Tom had spent 2 decades in basements, reading the stories they told about the people who inhabited the houses above them. This wasn't the basement of a man helping a stray dog. This was the basement of a man who'd brought his war home and discovered that some battles never end. They just find new victims. The chain wasn't rusty from weather, it was worn smooth from use. The stains on the concrete weren't from burst pipes. They were from blood and waste and the slow dissolution of hope. The dog finally lifted his head when Tom approached, and their eyes met across the space between species. In those brown depths, Tom saw something that made his chest tight with recognition, the look of a soldier who'd been abandoned by his own army. There was intelligence there, and pain so deep it had carved permanent shadows beneath the surface. This wasn't just a dog. This was a veteran. Tom climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. Marcus waited at the top, swaying slightly, a beer can crumpled in his fist like evidence of his own defeat. "Look, I can pay cash," Marcus said, misreading Tom's expression. "Just fix the pipe. Don't worry about anything else you might have seen down there." But Tom Wilson was the kind of man who couldn't ignore broken things, even when fixing them meant breaking something else. He pulled his phone from his pocket with hands that felt disconnected from his body, his thumb hovering over the numbers that would change everything for everyone in this house. 911, three simple digits that would bring police sirens and questions and consequences that couldn't be undone. "I'm sorry," Tom said, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was apologizing to Marcus or to the dog waiting in the darkness below. The call connected on the second ring, and Tom Wilson discovered that some repairs required more than wrenches. They required courage to break things that were already broken beyond any tool's ability to mend. The police arrived in a symphony of red and blue lights that painted Marcus's house like a crime scene, which Tom realized with sick certainty it had become. Officer Janet Martinez, no relation to Carlos, though the coincidence would haunt everyone involved, took one look at Tom's pale face and knew this wasn't a simple plumbing emergency. Behind her, Dr. Sarah Mitchell climbed out of her emergency veterinary van, called by dispatch when Tom had mentioned an injured animal during his 911 call. Sarah had been awake anyway, unable to sleep in the apartment that still echoed with Max's absence. Emergency calls were a blessing and a curse. They gave her purpose, but reminded her of the night she'd been too late to save her own dog. She grabbed her medical kit and followed the voices into a house that felt like grief had taken up permanent residence in its walls. Marcus met them at the door with the desperate politeness of a man trying to control an avalanche with his bare hands. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Wilson here was fixing my pipes and got confused about what he saw. I've been helping a stray dog trying to nurse him back to health. Sometimes kindness looks different to people who don't understand the situation." But Sarah had worked with enough abuse cases to recognize the particular way truth twisted itself into self-serving lies. She followed Officer Martinez down the basement stairs, her medical training automatically cataloging details, the smell of infection, the sound of labored breathing, the way shadows could hide evidence of systematic cruelty. When her flashlight beam found Rex, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates realigning around a new center of gravity. The German Shepherd looked up at her approach, and Sarah saw immediately what Tom had recognized. This wasn't just any dog. The way Rex held himself despite his obvious pain, the alertness in his eyes even while his body betrayed him, the military tattoo partially visible through matted fur. This was a working dog, a soldier who'd been betrayed by the very system that had trained him to serve. "Sweet Jesus," Officer Martinez whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her radio. "Dispatch, we're going to need animal control and probably a detective. This is bad." Rex weighed 37 pounds when he should have weighed 65. His ribs created mountain ranges beneath skin pulled tight as parchment. Fresh wounds crisscrossed his flanks in patterns too deliberate to be accidental, while older scars spoke of months of systematic abuse. But it was his eyes that broke Sarah's professional composure, brown depths that held intelligence, pain, and something worse than either, acceptance. As Sarah knelt beside him, Rex began to tremble. Not from cold, but from a fear so deeply ingrained it had become involuntary reflex. When the police radio crackled overhead, the dog's entire body went rigid, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. PTSD, as real and devastating in animals as in humans. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, keeping her voice soft and her movements slow. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Rex had clearly learned that human promises were weapons disguised as comfort, that gentle voices often preceded violence. The medical examination revealed the full scope of Marcus's crimes. 3 broken ribs in various stages of healing. Malnutrition so severe that Rex's body had begun consuming its own muscle tissue. Infected wounds that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than neglect. But most devastating was Rex's psychological state. The way he flinched from human touch, the manner in which he tried to make himself invisible, the complete absence of tail wagging that should have been natural to any dog. Upstairs, Marcus's story began to unravel under Officer Martinez's patient questioning. The stray dog had ownership papers hidden in a kitchen drawer. The few weeks became months when neighbors mentioned hearing sounds from the basement since October. The trying to help dissolved when Sarah's preliminary examination revealed injuries that could only have been inflicted intentionally. His name was Carlos, Marcus finally admitted, his voice breaking like ice under pressure. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I tried, but I couldn't. I couldn't save Carlos, and every time I looked at this dog, I saw my failure. I saw my friend dying and I couldn't stop it, and the dog kept looking at me like he expected me to fix everything, and I just couldn't. The confession spilled out of Marcus like blood from a reopened wound. Afghanistan, 2019, Route Phoenix. An IED explosion that killed Sergeant Carlos Martinez and traumatized his K-9 partner. Marcus had been there, had watched his best friend throw himself on the device to save the unit, had seen Rex trying to wake Carlos's still body for hours afterward. When the military retired Rex due to his own PTSD, Marcus had convinced himself he was honoring Carlos's memory by taking the dog. Instead, he'd become the enemy Carlos had died fighting against. Sarah listened to the confession while gently examining Rex, her hands finding each scar, each evidence of betrayal. The dog didn't resist her touch, but he didn't welcome it either. He simply endured, as he'd learned to endure, everything else. In his military tattoo, Sarah found a serial number that would lead to service records, to the truth about who Rex had been before Marcus's basement became his prison. This dog saved lives, she told Officer Martinez, her voice thick with emotion she usually kept professional. Look at this tattoo. He's a veteran, a hero, and someone turned him into a victim. The decision to arrest Marcus felt inevitable and heartbreaking simultaneously. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he looked back at the basement door one final time. I loved Carlos, he said, tears cutting tracks through the stubble on his cheeks. I loved him like a brother, and I was supposed to protect what mattered to him. Instead, I became the monster he died fighting. Rex watched the humans move around him with the detached interest of someone who'd learned not to invest hope in temporary kindness. But when Sarah approached with a transport carrier, something in his damaged psyche recognized that this moment was different. This wasn't rescue. Rescue implied someone had been looking for him. This was salvage, the careful retrieval of something valuable from the wreckage of its former life. As Sarah loaded Rex into her van, she made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. We're going to fix this, she whispered to the broken soldier in the kennel behind her. I don't know how yet, but we're going to fix this. Rex didn't acknowledge her words, but for the first time in months he closed his eyes and allowed himself to sleep while someone else was responsible for his safety. The recovery room at Second Chance's animal clinic became Rex's new bunker, though he approached it with the same wariness he'd once reserved for suspicious packages in Afghan markets. Sarah had lined the space with soft blankets, positioned food and water bowls within easy reach, and installed a small heater to combat the February cold that seemed to have settled permanently in Rex's bones. Yet, for the first 72 hours, he remained pressed against the far corner, his body creating the smallest possible target while his eyes tracked every movement through the glass partition. Food became the first battlefield in their undeclared war against despair. Sarah tried everything: premium kibble, wet food, even hand-cooked chicken breast that filled the clinic with aromas that should have triggered any dog's appetite. Rex regarded each offering with the suspicion of a soldier who'd learned that gifts often contained explosives. He would wait until Sarah left, then approach the bowls with movements so careful they seemed choreographed, eating just enough to survive while his body continued its slow dissolution. On the fourth day, Sarah discovered Rex's secret. Hidden beneath one of the blankets, she found a small pile of kibble, not hoarded for later consumption, but arranged in a precise pattern that spoke of military training. Rex had been organizing his food into tactical formations, a behavior that made Sarah's chest tight with recognition of just how deeply his trauma had penetrated. Even eating had become a strategic operation for a mind that couldn't distinguish between nourishment and potential ambush. The nights were worse. Sarah began staying late at the clinic, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork, but actually to monitor Rex during the hours when his defenses crumbled. She watched through the security camera as he paced the small room in patterns that suggested patrol routes, his movements precise despite his weakened condition. Sometimes he would stop at the window and stare into the darkness beyond, his ears pricked forward as if listening for sounds that existed only in his memory. Sleep, when it came, brought no peace. Rex's legs would twitch and paddle as if he were still running through Afghan villages, and soft whimpers would escape his throat, sounds that spoke of dreams where he was still trying to save Carlos, still failing to prevent the explosion that had shattered both their worlds. Sarah would find herself holding her breath during these episodes, afraid that waking him might be worse than letting the nightmares run their course. The breakthrough came during the clinic's second week of Rex's residency, and it arrived through the most unlikely medium imaginable. Sarah had been humming while organizing medical supplies, an old folk song her grandmother had sung during her own recovery from wartime trauma, when she noticed Rex's ears prick forward with something beyond mere alertness. For the first time since his rescue, his tail moved, not a wag, barely a twitch, but movement that spoke of recognition rather than fear. Research into Rex's military service records revealed the connection. Sergeant Carlos Martinez had been known among his unit for humming that same song, Shenandoah, during long night watches in Kandahar province. It had become his signature, a piece of American melody carried into spaces where America existed only in the hearts of soldiers far from home. Rex had heard that song during the happiest moments of his service, when he and Carlos worked together as a team that saved lives and found hope in impossible places. The discovery opened new pathways in Sarah's treatment approach. She began incorporating music therapy into Rex's routine, playing recordings of military bands and folk songs that might trigger positive associations. Rex's responses were subtle but unmistakable. A relaxation in his shoulders when Amazing Grace filled the room, a lifting of his head when parade marches echoed through the speakers. Music became their shared language, a way of communicating across the species barrier that trauma had made even wider. Physical healing progressed more slowly than emotional recognition, but progress occurred in measurable increments. Rex gained 2 pounds during his second week, then 3 more during his third. His coat began to regain some of its original luster, and the infected wounds gradually yielded to antibiotic treatment. But for every step forward, there were setbacks that reminded Sarah how deeply damage could penetrate. Loud noises still sent Rex into panic attacks that could last for hours. The sound of metal clanging, too reminiscent of IED fragments, would cause him to retreat so far into psychological hiding that Sarah wondered if he would ever return. The first time Rex allowed physical contact, it happened by accident. Sarah had been cleaning his wounds with her usual careful attention to maintaining distance when Rex shifted position and her hand brushed against his head. Instead of flinching away, he froze completely, his entire body going rigid as if he were processing this new data about human touch that didn't involve pain. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, they remained connected. Sarah's palm against Rex's skull, both of them afraid to move and break whatever spell had made this moment possible. "Good boy," Sarah whispered, and immediately felt Rex tense beneath her touch. The words carried too much history, too many associations with commands that had preceded violence. She learned to substitute other phrases: "You're safe," "I'm here," "It's okay," words that carried comfort without the weight of military structure that had been corrupted by Marcus's abuse. The outside world intruded on their careful progress in the form of Sarah's family, who arrived unannounced one Thursday evening with concerns that had been building since Rex's arrival. Her sister Linda led the intervention with the efficiency of a corporate executive addressing a failing department, while their parents flanked her with expressions of carefully controlled worry. "Sarah, honey, we understand you're trying to help this animal," Linda began, her voice carrying the patronizing tone that had driven Sarah to veterinary school in the first place. "But you're spending thousands of dollars on a dog that might never recover. You've got a business to run, bills to pay. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let go." The suggestion of euthanasia hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything Sarah had built. She looked through the glass partition at Rex, who seemed to sense the tension in the room and had retreated to his corner with the wariness of someone who'd learned that human arguments often ended in violence for whoever was weakest. "He's not just any dog," Sarah said, her voice carrying steel that surprised even her. "He's a veteran. He saved lives. He deserves the same respect we'd give any soldier coming home from war." But even as she spoke, she could see the doubt in her family's eyes, the calculation that weighed sentiment against practicality and found her emotional investment dangerously imbalanced. The confrontation escalated when Linda pointed out that Sarah hadn't taken a day off in 3 weeks, that she was spending her own money on Rex's care, that she was using the clinic's resources to treat a single animal while paying clients waited for appointments. The accusations stung because they contained enough truth to wound. Sarah was using Rex as a way to avoid dealing with her own grief, transforming her inability to save Max into an obsession with saving his symbolic replacement. "You can't bring Max back by saving this dog," her mother said gently, the kindness in her voice making the words hurt even more. "Honey, you're trying to fix something that can't be fixed, and you're breaking yourself in the process." That night, after her family had left with promises to talk more later, Sarah sat alone in Rex's recovery room, her back against the wall while he maintained his careful distance in the opposite corner. The silence between them felt different now, less like fear and more like shared understanding. Both of them were broken things trying to heal in a world that kept suggesting it might be easier to give up. "They don't understand," Sarah told Rex, her voice barely above a whisper. "They see a damaged dog. I see a soldier who never got to come home." Rex's ears moved forward at the sound of her voice, and for a moment Sarah could have sworn she saw something like agreement in his dark eyes. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Tom Wilson, the plumber whose conscience had started this entire chain of events. He arrived with a thermos of coffee and an expression that suggested he'd been carrying something heavy for longer than he could manage alone. "I wanted to see how he was doing," Tom said, gesturing toward Rex, who regarded the newcomer with the wariness of someone who'd learned that familiar faces could hide dangerous intentions. "I keep thinking about that night, about what might have happened if I'd just fixed the pipes and left. Whether doing the right thing was actually right." Sarah poured them both coffee and found herself sharing doubts she hadn't admitted to anyone else. The financial strain of Rex's care, the family pressure, the nagging question of whether she was prolonging suffering rather than preventing it. Tom listened with the patience of someone who'd spent decades fixing problems that had no clear solutions, understanding that sometimes the hardest repairs were the ones you couldn't see. "My grandfather was in Korea," Tom said finally. "Came back different, you know," Spent 40 years jumping at loud noises, checking locks 3 times before bed. Everyone said he was fine, that he just needed to move on. But I remember watching him with the neighborhood dogs. They were the only things that didn't seem to remind him of what he'd lost over there. The conversation continued for an hour, 2 strangers bound together by their shared responsibility for Rex's fate. Tom's presence somehow made the burden feel more manageable, as if caring for one broken soldier was a job too big for one person, but possible for 2. When he left, he pressed a folded check into Sarah's hand, not charity, but partnership in a mission neither of them fully understood, but both felt compelled to complete. That evening, Rex approached Sarah's chair for the first time since his arrival. Not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could hear his breathing, could see the intelligence in his eyes that trauma hadn't managed to extinguish. They sat together in comfortable silence while snow began to fall outside the window. 2 survivors learning that healing sometimes required nothing more than the courage to occupy the same space without expecting anything from each other except the promise to stay. The break-in occurred on a Tuesday night in March, when Chicago's winter had finally begun loosening its grip but still held enough bite to keep honest people indoors. Sarah had stayed late at the clinic again, ostensibly to update patient records, but actually because Rex had shown signs of progress that day. He'd eaten his entire dinner while she watched, a breakthrough that felt monumental after weeks of careful coaxing. She was reviewing his medical charts when the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet sanctuary she'd built around their shared healing. The crash came from the front office, followed by voices that carried the desperate edge of people who'd crossed lines they couldn't uncross. Sarah's first instinct was to call the police, but her phone was charging in the office where the intruders now moved with the clumsy urgency of amateur criminals searching for something specific. Through the clinic's internal windows, she could see 2 figures rifling through cabinets with flashlights held between their teeth, their movements suggesting they knew exactly what they were looking for. Drug addicts, she realized with sick certainty. The clinic's controlled substances were locked in a safe, but desperate people often operated on hope rather than information. Sarah pressed herself against the wall of Rex's recovery room, her mind racing through options that all seemed to end with confrontation she wasn't prepared for. She could hide and hope they'd leave empty-handed, or she could try to reach the panic button installed near the front desk, a journey that would require crossing open space where the intruders could see her. Rex had gone completely still at the first sound of breaking glass, his body dropping into a crouch that spoke of muscle memory older than his trauma. His ears were pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he processed information that his damaged psyche was struggling to categorize. Were these the sounds of danger he should flee from or threats he should engage? For a dog whose world had been turned upside down by violence, the distinction between fight and flight had become fatally blurred. "Where's the fucking safe?" one of the intruders hissed, his voice carrying the thin desperation of someone riding the knife edge of withdrawal. "You said veterinary clinics always keep the good stuff accessible for emergencies." "Check behind the desk," his partner replied, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of drawers being yanked from their runners and dumped onto the floor. Medical supplies scattered with crystalline crashes that made Rex's body coil tighter, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow in a way Sarah recognized as the precursor to panic. The breakthrough moment came when one of the intruders knocked over a metal instrument tray, the crash echoing through the clinic like gunfire in an Afghan valley. Rex's entire body went rigid, his eyes dilating as present reality collapsed into past trauma. But instead of retreating into psychological hiding as he'd done during previous episodes, something else triggered in his war-trained mind. The recognition that Sarah, his reluctant but consistent caregiver, was in the same space as the sounds that meant danger. What happened next unfolded with the terrible precision of military training reasserting itself over months of learned helplessness. Rex rose from his crouch with fluid grace that belied his recent weight gain, every ounce of his 43 pounds suddenly remembering what it meant to be a weapon in service of protection. The dog, who'd spent weeks flinching from human touch, moved toward the clinic's main door with purpose that seemed to flow from some deep well of courage that trauma hadn't managed to poison. Sarah watched through the partition as Rex positioned himself between her location and the intruders, his body language transforming from that of a victim to that of a guardian. His head lowered, his muscles coiling beneath fur that suddenly seemed darker in the clinic's emergency lighting. When he finally moved, it was with the explosive precision of a soldier who'd remembered his duty. The first intruder, a thin man whose movement spoke of desperation rather than malice, rounded the corner into the hallway where Rex waited and found himself face to face with 60 pounds of German Shepherd who'd decided that some things were worth fighting for. Rex's attack wasn't the wild assault of an angry animal, but the calculated intervention of a trained protection dog who'd found his purpose again. He took the man down with efficiency that spoke of countless hours of training, his teeth finding the intruder's forearm with precision that neutralized without killing. The second intruder heard his partner's screams and came running with a crowbar raised like a weapon, only to discover that Rex had positioned himself strategically to control the narrow hallway. The dog's training kicked in with muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. He'd done this before, in places where the stakes were measured in lives rather than stolen pharmaceuticals. But this time, the mission was personal rather than patriotic, driven by an emotion he'd thought Marcus had beaten out of him. Loyalty to someone who'd shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. Sarah found herself frozen in a moment that seemed to exist outside normal time, watching Rex transform from patient to protector while her mind struggled to process the reversal. This was the dog who'd flinched from her touch just weeks ago, who'd arranged his food in defensive patterns, who'd spent countless nights reliving trauma that had convinced him humans were sources of pain rather than protection. Yet here he was, placing himself in danger to keep her safe. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes but felt like hours compressed into heartbeats. Rex controlled both intruders with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned that violence, properly applied, could serve protective rather than destructive purposes. He didn't maul them, his training was too precise for that, but he made it clear that their options were retreat or escalation to a level of conflict they weren't prepared for. When the police arrived, summoned by the clinic's silent alarm system, they found 2 would-be thieves sitting on the floor with their hands raised while a German Shepherd maintained perfect guard position between them and the hallway leading to the recovery rooms. Rex's posture was alert but controlled, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline that must have been coursing through his system. For the first time since his rescue, he looked like what he'd always been beneath the trauma, a professional. Officer Martinez, the same Janet Martinez who'd arrested Marcus months earlier, recognized Rex immediately and felt something shift in her understanding of what justice looked like. Here was a dog who'd been systematically abused by one human using the same protective instincts to save another human from harm. The irony wasn't lost on her that Rex had become both victim and hero in the space of a single winter. His story, a complex narrative that defied simple categories of good and evil. Sarah emerged from the recovery room on shaking legs, her mind still processing what she'd witnessed. Rex turned at her approach, his tail moving in what might have been the beginning of a wag, the first voluntary expression of pleasure he'd shown since his rescue. When she knelt beside him, he didn't flinch from her touch. Instead, he leaned slightly into her hand, accepting comfort while maintaining his watchful posture toward the intruders who were being processed by the police. "Good boy, Rex," Sarah whispered, then immediately tensed as she realized what she'd said. Those words had been corrupted by Marcus's abuse, turned into a mockery that preceded violence rather than a genuine expression of praise. But Rex's reaction surprised her. Instead of flinching, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed clearer than they'd been in months, as if protecting her had somehow restored a piece of himself he'd thought was lost forever. The aftermath brought complications Sarah hadn't anticipated. Rex had bitten the first intruder badly enough to require stitches, and while the attack was clearly defensive, it raised legal questions about liability and the wisdom of keeping a dog with a history of trauma in a public facility. The insurance company wanted documentation, the police needed statements, and suddenly Sarah found herself defending Rex's actions to people who saw only risk rather than redemption. But something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between Sarah and Rex during those 3 minutes of crisis. He'd chosen to protect rather than hide, to engage rather than retreat, and in doing so had proven to both of them that trauma didn't have to be permanent. The dog who'd spent weeks learning to trust had discovered that trust could flow both directions, that sometimes the one being saved could become the one doing the saving. That night, Rex slept peacefully for the first time since his rescue, his body relaxed in a way that spoke of purpose fulfilled rather than energy depleted. Sarah watched him through the partition and realized that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. Sometimes it was about discovering that broken things could still be useful, that damaged didn't necessarily mean destroyed. Rex had found his way back to being a protector, and in protecting her, he'd begun to heal the part of himself that Marcus's cruelty had never quite managed to reach. The next morning brought reporters, drawn by the story of an abused dog turning hero, but Sarah declined their interviews. This wasn't a story about redemption that could be packaged into feel-good segments for the evening news. This was about the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust between species, the kind of healing that happened in quiet moments rather than dramatic gestures. Rex had shown her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in spite of fear when something you cared about was threatened. The complications began 3 days after the break-in, when Rex collapsed during what should have been a routine morning walk around the clinic's small exercise yard. Sarah had been encouraged by his progress. He'd been eating regularly, allowing touch, even showing moments of what might have been contentment. But the stress of protecting her had reopened wounds that went deeper than the physical scars crisscrossing his body. Internal bleeding from injuries sustained during the confrontation, combined with the psychological toll of returning to combat mode after months of learned helplessness. Dr. Peterson, the emergency veterinarian Sarah called for a second opinion, delivered his assessment with the clinical detachment that came from years of making impossible recommendations to devastated pet owners. Rex's condition had deteriorated rapidly. Blood loss from internal injuries, kidney stress from malnutrition, and a heart rhythm that suggested his body was finally surrendering to the cumulative damage of months of abuse. The prognosis was grim enough that Peterson used words like quality of life and humane options while avoiding Sarah's eyes. "He's suffered enough," Peterson said gently, his hand resting on Rex's still form as monitors tracked vitals that grew weaker by the hour. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is prevent further suffering. He's been through more trauma than any animal should endure, and his body is telling us it can't take any more. You've given him love and care in his final weeks. That's more than many animals ever receive." Sarah found herself in the position she'd dreaded since the night she'd first knelt beside Rex in Marcus's basement, weighing love against mercy, hope against reality. The dog who'd shown such courage in protecting her now lay sedated and still, his breathing shallow enough that she had to watch carefully to see the rise and fall of his chest. Every instinct she'd developed as a veterinarian told her that Peterson was right, that continuing treatment would be prolonging suffering rather than preventing it. The clinic's waiting room became a vigil space as word of Rex's condition spread through the small community that had formed around his story. Tom Wilson arrived first, still wearing work clothes that smelled of pipe compound and determination. Behind him came Officer Martinez, who'd followed Rex's progress through official reports that had grown increasingly hopeful until this sudden reversal. Even some of Sarah's family members appeared, their earlier criticism replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing someone's final moments. The financial reality added another layer of cruelty to an already impossible situation. Rex's emergency treatment had exhausted Sarah's reserves and pushed the clinic's resources beyond sustainable limits. The surgery that might save his life would cost more than Sarah could afford, and even if successful, it would only address the immediate crisis while leaving his underlying trauma untouched. Her accountant had been calling with increasing urgency about overdue bills, while her family's concerns about her obsession with Rex gained painful validity with each expensive intervention that failed to restore him to health. "You can't save everyone," Linda said during a family meeting that felt more like an intervention. "And sometimes, trying to save someone who can't be saved destroys the people trying to help them. Sarah, you're killing yourself for a dog who might not even want to be saved." But as Sarah sat beside Rex's motionless form, watching machines monitor the slow decline of his vital signs, she realized that this wasn't really about saving him anymore. It was about honoring what he'd given her, the courage to care again after Max's death, the reminder that broken things could still choose to protect what mattered to them. The lesson that healing was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Rex had taught her that love could exist in the spaces between heartbeats, in the decision to trust, despite every reason to remain guarded. The breaking point came at 3 a.m. on Rex's second night in critical condition, when his heart rate dropped so low that the monitors began their insistent warning beeps. Sarah had been dozing in the chair beside his bed when the alarms woke her, and she found herself looking into Rex's eyes, the first time he'd been conscious and alert since his collapse. For a moment that felt suspended outside time, they regarded each other with the understanding that passes between soldiers who've shared impossible circumstances. Rex's tail moved once, barely a twitch but unmistakably deliberate. His eyes, still clouded with pain medication, held something that Sarah recognized as gratitude mixed with resignation. He was saying goodbye, she realized, offering her absolution for the choice she was about to make. The dog, who'd spent months learning to trust her, was now trusting her with the most difficult decision of all. Sarah's phone call to Dr. Peterson at 3:17 a.m. carried the weight of surrender disguised as mercy. "I think it's time," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of machines tracking Rex's failing body. "He's suffered enough. He's been trying to tell me for hours, and I finally understand what he needs." But as Peterson prepared the clinic for Rex's final procedure, an unexpected visitor arrived with news that would complicate everything Sarah thought she understood about mercy and healing. Marcus Rodriguez stood in the clinic's doorway, sober for the first time in months, carrying flowers that seemed absurdly inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd come to face. The restraining order had been lifted as part of his plea agreement, and his lawyer had informed him of Rex's critical condition during what everyone assumed would be their final legal consultation. "I know I don't have the right to be here," Marcus said, his voice carrying the hollow sound of someone who'd spent months confronting the full scope of his actions. "But I needed to see him. I needed to try to explain, even if he can't understand, even if it doesn't matter anymore." Sarah's first instinct was to call security, to protect Rex from the person who'd caused his suffering in the first place. But something in Marcus's bearing stopped her. The careful way he moved, as if afraid his presence might cause additional damage. The flowers held like an offering to a grave he'd dug with his own hands. This wasn't the aggressive, defensive man who'd been arrested in his basement. This was someone who'd been broken by the recognition of what he'd become. 5 minutes, Sarah said finally, her voice carrying steel wrapped in exhaustion. You can see him for 5 minutes, and then you leave. And if you do anything to upset him, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your sentence in maximum security. Marcus approached Rex's bedside with the careful movements of someone approaching a shrine to his own failures. The dog's eyes opened at his presence, and for a moment Sarah held her breath, expecting panic or aggression, or the kind of fear response that had characterized Rex's early days at the clinic. Instead, Rex simply watched Marcus with what might have been recognition, his breathing unchanged, his body language suggesting wariness rather than terror. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking on words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of his crimes. "I'm so sorry, boy. Carlos loved you and I was supposed to protect you, and instead I became everything he died fighting against. You deserve better. You deserve someone who could see your courage instead of just his own cowardice." What happened next defied every expectation Sarah had formed about trauma and forgiveness. Rex's tail moved again, not the unconscious twitch of earlier, but a deliberate acknowledgement that suggested something beyond simple recognition. He was responding to Marcus's presence not with fear, but with something that looked remarkably like understanding, as if the dog's capacity for forgiveness was larger than his capacity for holding grudges. The moment stretched between them, abuser and victim, destroyer and destroyed, while Sarah watched an interaction that challenged everything she thought she knew about healing and redemption. Rex wasn't afraid of Marcus anymore, she realized. The man's presence didn't trigger panic or defensive posturing. Instead, Rex seemed to be offering something that looked remarkably like absolution, as if he understood that Marcus was as much a casualty of war as he was, that they were both soldiers who'd lost their way home. Marcus left the flowers beside Rex's bed and walked away without another word. But his brief presence had changed something fundamental about the situation. Rex's vital signs had actually improved during the visit, his heart rate stabilizing, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular. It was as if seeing Marcus's genuine remorse had released some tension that medication couldn't touch, some psychological wound that required forgiveness rather than surgery to heal. Doctor. Peterson arrived an hour later to find a patient whose condition had inexplicably improved from critical to merely serious. "I've seen spontaneous recoveries before," he told Sarah, "but usually they involve some change in treatment protocol, not whatever this was." He postponed the euthanasia procedure, recommending they wait 24 hours to see if the improvement would continue or if it was simply the temporary rally that sometimes preceded death. Sarah spent that night beside Rex's bed, watching him sleep more peacefully than he had since his rescue, wondering if healing sometimes required confronting the source of trauma rather than simply hiding from it. Rex had faced his abuser and found strength rather than fear, forgiveness rather than hatred. In doing so, he'd taught her something about courage that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the choice to love, despite having every reason not to. Marcus returned the next evening, not with flowers this time, but with a manila folder that contained secrets he'd carried alone for too long. Sarah found him sitting in the clinic's waiting room like a penitent in a cathedral, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched documents that seemed to weigh more than paper should. The restraining order technically allowed supervised visits, but Sarah's permission carried more weight than any legal document. She was the guardian of Rex's recovery, and Marcus understood that his presence depended entirely on her judgment. "There are things about Carlos and Rex that you need to know," Marcus said, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who'd practiced these words during sleepless nights. "Things that might help Rex heal if healing is still possible. I should have told you before, but I was afraid. Afraid of facing what Carlos really meant to both of us." The folder contained Rex's complete military service record, documents that Marcus had kept hidden since taking custody of the dog. Sarah spread the papers across the clinic's conference table while Rex dozed nearby, his condition stable enough that he could be moved from the intensive care unit, but still fragile enough that every breath felt precious. The story that emerged from the official reports painted a picture of partnership that transcended the usual bonds between handler and working dog. Sergeant Carlos Martinez had been 23 when he'd been assigned to Rex, a bright kid from Phoenix who'd joined the Army to pay for veterinary school, planning to work with animals in a context that didn't involve detecting improvised explosive devices. The pairing had been serendipitous rather than strategic. Carlos had been the only handler available when Rex completed his training, and their first weeks together had been marked by mutual skepticism rather than instant connection. But the partnership had evolved into something extraordinary. Rex's service record documented 67 successful explosives detections over 18 months. But the numbers couldn't capture the lives saved or the trust built between species in a landscape where trust could mean the difference between coming home and becoming a casualty statistic. Carlos had written detailed reports about Rex's behavior patterns, his preferences, his fears, observations that revealed a handler who saw his dog as an individual rather than equipment. "Carlos used to say that Rex saved his life every day," Marcus said, watching Sarah read through reports that documented their missions together. "Not just by finding bombs, but by giving him something to care about besides himself. Carlos was struggling with depression, with the weight of what we were doing over there. Rex gave him purpose." The folder contained photographs that Marcus had never shown anyone, images of Carlos and Rex during downtime, playing fetch in the Afghan dust, sharing meals, sleeping side by side in circumstances that would have made civilian comfort impossible. In these pictures, Rex looked nothing like the traumatized animal Sarah had rescued from Marcus's basement. His coat gleamed with health, his posture radiated confidence, and his eyes held the intelligent alertness of a working dog who loved his job. But the most revealing document was a letter Carlos had written to his parents just weeks before his death, a letter that Marcus had found among his friend's effects and kept hidden out of shame. In it, Carlos described Rex not just as a partner, but as the brother he'd never had, expressing concerns about what would happen to the dog if something happened to him during their deployment. "I've made arrangements for Rex to be retired to a good family if anything happens to me," Carlos had written. "Marcus has promised to look after him, and I trust Marcus with my life every day. Rex is special. He's got more heart than most humans I know, and he deserves to live somewhere safe where he can just be a dog instead of a soldier. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. But please know that Rex and I were happy together. We took care of each other." The letter hit Sarah like a physical blow, revealing the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal not just of Rex, but of his best friend's final wishes. Carlos had trusted Marcus to provide the safe haven that would allow Rex to transition from soldier to pet, and instead Marcus had created the very nightmare Carlos had died hoping to prevent. The weight of that broken promise explained much about Marcus's descent into self-destruction and the particular cruelty he'd visited upon the animal who represented his greatest failure. "I read that letter every day for 6 months, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Every day, promising myself I'd be the person Carlos believed I was. But Rex kept looking at me with Carlos's eyes, kept waiting for me to be someone I couldn't figure out how to be. And instead of rising to meet his expectations, I blamed him for having them. As if summoned by the sound of his name, Rex stirred from his doze and lifted his head toward Marcus. The improvement in his condition over the past 24 hours had been steady enough to cautiously optimistic, but his movements still carried the careful deliberation of someone managing pain. Yet when he looked at Marcus now, there was something different in his expression. Not fear or anger, but a kind of recognition that went beyond simple identification. Sarah watched the interaction between Marcus and Rex with growing understanding of the complex trauma that bound them together. They were both casualties of the same war, both survivors of the same loss, both carrying guilt that had metastasized into self-destruction. Carlos's death had broken them in different ways, but it had also created a connection that abuse couldn't entirely sever. They were the only witnesses to a friendship that had defined the best parts of both their lives. "There's something else," Marcus said, reaching into the folder for a final document that he'd clearly saved for last. Carlos recorded messages for Rex, voice recordings on his phone. "I found them after the explosion. I kept meaning to delete them because they were too painful to hear. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy Carlos's voice." The recordings were stored on an old smartphone that Marcus handled like a religious artifact. He pressed play on the first file, and Carlos's voice filled the clinic conference room with warmth that seemed to resurrect the dead. "Hey, buddy, it's Daddy. I know you miss home, but we're doing important work here. You're keeping us all safe, and I'm so proud of you. When we get back to the States, I'm going to take you to that dog beach in San Diego, and you can chase seagulls until you're too tired to move." Rex's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. His ears pricked forward, his tail began a tentative wag, and he struggled to his feet despite his injuries. For a moment, Sarah feared the excitement might be too much for his weakened system, but Rex's vital signs remained stable even as his entire body orientation changed. He was looking around the room as if expecting Carlos to materialize from the sound of his voice, hope and confusion warring in his expression. The second recording was even more personal. "Rex, I need you to listen to me, okay? If something happens to me over here, I need you to know that it's not your fault. You're the best partner I've ever had, and you've made me a better person. Marcus is going to take care of you, and you're going to have a good life. But I need you to trust the people who want to help you, even when it's scary. Can you do that for me, buddy? Can you be brave?" Tears were streaming down Marcus's face as Carlos's voice continued. "I love you, Rex. I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. You saved me in ways you'll never understand, and if I don't make it home, I want you to save someone else. That's what we do, right? We save people. We take care of each other." The recording ended in silence that felt too large for the small conference room. Rex remained standing, swaying slightly, but determined to stay upright, his eyes still searching for the source of the voice that had once meant safety and love. Sarah understood that she was witnessing a form of communication that transcended death. Carlos reaching across the grave to remind Rex of who he'd been before trauma rewrote his story. "Play it again," Sarah said softly, and Marcus complied. This time, Rex seemed to understand that the voice was a memory rather than a presence. He settled back onto his bed but remained alert, his breathing deeper and more relaxed than it had been since his rescue. The recordings weren't bringing Carlos back, but they were returning pieces of Rex that Sarah had thought were lost forever. Over the next hour, they listened to 12 recordings that documented the evolution of a friendship that had sustained both man and dog through the worst circumstances imaginable. Carlos talked about everything: their missions, his fears, his dreams for their future together, his gratitude for Rex's partnership. In response, Rex's demeanor continued to brighten, his movements becoming more fluid, his interactions with Sarah and Marcus becoming more trusting. The final recording was the longest and most devastating. Carlos had made it the night before the patrol that would kill him, as if he'd sensed what was coming. Rex, I had a dream last night that we were back home playing in the snow. You were so happy, buddy, running around like a puppy again. I want you to remember that feeling, that pure joy of being alive and safe and loved. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens after that, I want you to find that feeling again. Promise me you'll try to be happy. Promise me you'll let good people love you. When the recording ended, Rex had moved closer to Marcus than he'd been since their reunion. Not touching, but near enough that the tension that had characterized their previous interactions seemed to have dissipated. Sarah realized she was witnessing a form of healing that medical intervention couldn't provide, the restoration of context that allowed trauma to be understood as part of a larger story rather than the entire narrative. "He's remembering who he was before," Sarah said, watching Rex's transformation with wonder. "Before the explosion, before the abuse. He's remembering that he used to be loved." Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Carlos always said that Rex had the biggest heart of any creature he'd ever known. "I spent so long trying to kill that heart because it reminded me of my own failure, but maybe hearts don't die as easily as we think they do." The night that followed was the first since Rex's rescue that he slept without nightmares. Sarah monitored him through the clinic's security cameras and watched him rest with the deep relaxation of someone who'd found peace after carrying an unbearable burden. When she arrived the next morning, she found Marcus asleep in the waiting room chair, having spent the night as an unofficial guardian of the dog he'd once tormented. Rex's recovery accelerated dramatically over the following weeks, as if Carlos's voice had provided a key that unlocked healing pathways no medical treatment could access. But more importantly, the recordings had created a bridge between Marcus and Rex that allowed them to begin the slow work of rebuilding trust. They were no longer just abuser and victim. They were two survivors of the same loss, two mourners at the same grave, two hearts learning that love could survive even the most devastating betrayals. 6 months later, the Second Chances Animal Clinic bore little resemblance to the sterile medical facility where Rex had first learned to trust again. The waiting room now displayed photographs of success stories, animals who'd found their way from trauma to healing. But Rex's picture held the place of honor above Sarah's desk, not because his recovery had been the most dramatic, but because it had taught everyone involved that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Spring had arrived in Chicago with the particular intensity of a city that had survived another brutal winter, and Rex moved through the clinic's expanded facilities with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. At 58 pounds, he'd regained not just his physical health, but the bearing that spoke of his military training, alert without being anxious, protective without being aggressive, gentle with the smaller animals who shared his space while maintaining the dignity of a veteran who'd earned his stripes in places most creatures never saw. The transformation in Rex's role had evolved organically, beginning when Sarah noticed how other traumatized animals responded to his presence. There was something about his calm energy, his patient acceptance of medical procedures, his ability to remain steady in situations that might trigger fear in less experienced patients, that made him a natural therapy assistant. Sarah had formalized his training through a program for veterans therapy dogs, but Rex seemed to understand his new mission intuitively. He was helping other broken souls find their way back to wholeness. Marcus arrived every Tuesday and Thursday for what had become their shared commitment to Rex's continued therapy work. The terms of his probation required community service, but his volunteer hours at the clinic had long exceeded any legal obligation. Watching Marcus work with Rex and the other animals, Sarah sometimes marveled at the man's transformation. From the angry, desperate person she'd met in that basement to someone whose patience with traumatized creatures seemed limitless. "He understands them," Dr. Peterson had observed during one of Rex's routine checkups. Animals who've been abused often respond better to people who've experienced their own trauma. There's a recognition there, an authenticity that can't be faked. Marcus's sobriety had held for 7 months, supported by therapy, medication, and the daily reminder that Rex's recovery depended partly on his own stability. The relationship between Marcus and Rex had evolved into something that defied simple categorization. They weren't exactly friends. Too much history stood between them for that kind of easy companionship. But they'd become partners in a mission that honored Carlos's memory, while creating something new from the wreckage of their shared trauma. Rex seemed to understand that Marcus's presence was part of his healing rather than a reminder of his pain, while Marcus had learned to see Rex's strength as inspiration rather than accusation. Sarah's own healing had been less dramatic but no less profound. The financial strain of Rex's care had forced her to accept help from unexpected sources. Donations from the community that had followed Rex's story, volunteer assistance from veterinary students, even a fundraising campaign organized by Tom Wilson and his plumbing company. Learning to accept help had been almost as difficult as learning to provide it, but Rex's recovery had taught her that healing was rarely a solitary endeavor. The clinic's reputation had grown beyond Sarah's expectations, drawing clients who specifically sought her expertise with traumatized animals. She'd hired 2 additional veterinarians and expanded into a facility that could provide comprehensive care for animals recovering from abuse, neglect, and abandonment. Rex had become the unofficial ambassador for this mission, demonstrating to frightened animals and skeptical owners that recovery was possible even in the most severe cases. The breakthrough that completed Rex's transformation came during a visit from a group of veterans from the local VA hospital. Sarah had started a weekly program where combat veterans could spend time with animals who understood trauma in ways that transcended species barriers. Rex participated in these sessions with enthusiasm that reminded Sarah of the working dog he'd once been, but his role was now purely therapeutic rather than tactical. Among the veterans was an elderly man named Robert Chen, a Korean War survivor whose PTSD had been complicated by the recent death of his wife. Robert had been resistant to traditional therapy, skeptical of medications, and increasingly isolated in his grief. But when he met Rex, something shifted in his demeanor that his family hadn't seen in months. "This dog's seen combat," Robert said, not asking but stating a fact he recognized in Rex's bearing. "You can tell by the way he moves, the way he watches. He's got that look, like he's still on patrol but trying to remember how to be at peace." Rex seemed to understand that Robert needed something specific from their interaction. Instead of his usual gentle approach with new people, Rex positioned himself close enough for contact but didn't impose his presence. When Robert finally reached out to pet him, Rex remained perfectly still, as if he understood that this human's healing required proof that touch could exist without pain. The session lasted 2 hours, with Robert gradually relaxing into conversation about his own service, his wife's death, and the loneliness that had been consuming him since her funeral. Rex listened with the patient attention of a trained therapy animal, occasionally shifting position to maintain contact, but never demanding more attention than Robert was prepared to give. "He understands," Robert said as the session ended. "This dog understands what it's like to lose your partner in battle." The comment struck Sarah with particular force, because it revealed how completely Rex had integrated his military service with his current role. He wasn't hiding from his past, but using it to help others navigate their own trauma. The program's success led to formal recognition from the VA hospital and requests to expand the therapy services to other facilities. Rex's story became part of a larger narrative about healing that Sarah found herself sharing at conferences and in interviews, not as a feel-good tale of rescue and recovery, but as a complex example of how trauma could be transformed into purpose. Marcus's role in these presentations was initially reluctant, but became increasingly important as audiences responded to his honesty about the damage he'd caused and the work required to rebuild trust. His willingness to acknowledge his failures while demonstrating his commitment to making amends provided a model for other veterans struggling with their own destructive behaviors. "I broke something beautiful," Marcus would tell groups of veterans and their families. "Rex was a hero, and I turned him into a victim because I couldn't face my own pain. But this dog taught me that forgiveness is possible, that broken things can be repaired, and that sometimes the people who hurt us the most need our healing too." The one-year anniversary of Rex's rescue fell on a February day that mirrored the winter night when Tom Wilson had first heard whimpering from Marcus's basement. Sarah organized a small celebration at the clinic, inviting everyone who'd played a role in Rex's recovery. Tom, Officer Martinez, Dr. Peterson, even some of the veterans who'd participated in the therapy program. Rex moved through the gathering with the easy confidence of someone hosting a party in his own home. He greeted each guest with appropriate enthusiasm, tail wagging for familiar friends, polite interest for newer acquaintances, and special attention for the veterans who needed reassurance that they belonged in this community of healing. The afternoon's highlight came when Marcus presented Rex with a new collar. Not the military-style gear he'd worn during his service, but a simple leather collar engraved with his name and a single word: hero. It was a designation that acknowledged both his military service and his current role as a therapy dog, but more importantly, it represented Marcus's recognition of who Rex had always been beneath the trauma. When Sarah stood to address the small group, she found herself looking at faces that represented different aspects of healing. Tom's determination to do the right thing regardless of consequences, Marcus's commitment to rebuilding what he'd destroyed, Rex's ability to transform suffering into service. These relationships had grown from a crisis that could have ended in tragedy, creating connections that none of them had expected, but all of them needed. "Rex taught us that healing isn't about forgetting trauma," Sarah said, her hand resting on Rex's head as he sat beside her. "It's about finding ways to transform that trauma into something useful, something that helps others." He didn't recover despite his experiences. He recovered through them by learning to use his understanding of pain to ease pain in others. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Rex settled into his favorite spot by the clinic's front window, watching the Chicago street with the alert but relaxed attention of a guardian who'd found his place in the world. The dog who'd once cowered in a basement had become a beacon of hope for others navigating their own journeys from darkness to light, proving that even the most damaged hearts could learn to love again. Dear friends, Rex's journey from that cold Chicago basement to becoming a beacon of hope reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, not for a broken German shepherd, not for a struggling veteran like Marcus, and not for any of us carrying our own invisible wounds. At 55, 60, or 68, we might think our stories are written, that our mistakes define us, that healing is for younger hearts. But Rex proved that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing love despite having every reason to fear. Marcus showed us that redemption is possible even after causing terrible harm. Sarah discovered that sometimes saving others saves ourselves. These three souls, human and canine, created a family not through blood or convenience, but through the sacred act of refusing to give up on each other. In a world that often discards what's damaged, they chose repair over replacement. Their story whispers to every grandparent feeling forgotten, every retiree questioning their purpose. Every person wondering if their best days are behind them. Transformation is always possible when we open our hearts to unexpected love. Heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear collars. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they fix pipes and choose courage over comfort. What second chance in your own life brought unexpected joy? Have you ever found healing by helping others heal? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how hope found its way into your life.